Yeah, good morning. So, last session we learned about data binding. In previous session, we discussed about what is data binding, and in data binding, we learned about one technique, that is one-way binding. Data binding classified into several. We have one-way binding. How one-way binding works? In one-way binding, we access the data and display in the UI. But any change in the UI is not reflecting back, right? We saw that. One more important is in one-way binding, we can do this by using interpolation. That is actually by using a data binding expression. We can do by using property binding. Property binding we can do by using the square brace, and we can use attribute binding. Attribute binding, so we have to use ATTR and the attribute name. That's how we need to define. The property binding uses the property name. And why we need attribute binding, already we discussed. We need attribute binding because attribute binding properties, every property is not available as attributes. So we need to go with attribute binding, but all are one-way binding. Yesterday you saw that we can access the data and bind, but any change in that is not reflecting back. For that, we need to understand another concept, two-way binding. We have to understand two-way binding. Two-way binding is nothing but, so in this, we can bind the model data to view, and any change in the view will be reflected back. So two-way binding is nothing but, what is two-way binding? Let's say. So it is a data binding technique. It is a data binding technique where the model data is updated to view, and any change in view will be updated back to model. That's what two-way binding is. So model data is updated to view, and any change in the view will be updated back to the model. This is two-way binding technique. So we have one-way and two-way. But how Angular handles this two-way? How to manage two-way binding? For that, you need to understand concept. Then you can understand two-way binding. Actually, the concept of two-way binding is nothing but, so we have some model property called, suppose name is a string type property and it is having some data TV. Now we have to bind this to any element Suppose we have a text box. So in the text box, we need to display this name. Whatever name is there, we want to display that inside the text box. So we access this and bind to this by using a property binding technique already we learned. So by using value to that property, we will bind this name so that whatever value is there, the value comes and displays there. The value comes and displayed. Whatever value is there, the value is displayed. Now, if any change made in this text box, that means any change is made in the text box. If any changes are made in the text box, these changes, any changes are made in the text box, these changes are to be updated back. These changes need to be updated back. Now the question is, generally, how model knows that some change happened in the text box? That means any change in the text box need to be updated back. If any change has to update back, how model knows that some change happened in the value? Generally, if you are using JavaScript, jQuery, then how JavaScript jQuery tells that some change happened? For that, actually, we need to use events. We have to use events like onChange. We have to use events like onKeyUp, because after every character. That means keyUp indicates when you are typing every character, you are making a change in the text box for every character. Or you can use onKeyPress, or you can use onBlur. OnBlur means when it finish typing inside the text box, means it loses the focus. So we need events. These events are going to update back to the model. We need these events to update back. That means whenever the value changes, the events will identify and they will update the options back. They will update the options back. So technically, what is event binding? Event binding identifies the changes and it will update those changes into the model, right? Into the model, right? Who is these people? You contact your admin why this link is changing. For online people, I already explained that you need to fill up a form and you have to join through app. Were you not there in the classroom, you people? I already explained that you have to join through an app, right? If you are facing any problem, contact your admin, right? If you are facing any problem, contact your admins, whoever from where you joined this session, okay? You join through an app, and if you face any problem you don't know, then contact your admin, they will tell you, okay? Which app already? If you registered already, details are sent to your application app, your email. If you haven't registered, once contact your admin. Right. These people. Okay. Now here, how we can update these changes, how we can make the changes update back here. Updating the changes back is nothing but for that we need event. We need event. So 2 points are there. Actually, in order to handle two-way binding, we need two techniques. What are those? One is we need a property binding. We need property binding and we need event binding. These two are required. What property binding will do? Property binding will take the model data and it will display in the UI. What event binding will do? It will identify the changes and it will update back to the model. So property binding already you saw. Property binding, we bind by using this square brace, property binding. How event binding works? Event binding is a separate topic. We will learn in Angular separately event binding. As of now, simple point I will tell you. Generally in JavaScript, if you want to write events, how you define event? For example, if you have a text box, input type is equal to text. If we need to write an event, for that, then we generally write on key up. On key up, what function it have to perform, we need to define it. On key up, what function to perform. So technically, if you are dealing with Angular, then in Angular, this event is actually defined like this. In Angular, events are defined in parentheses. In parentheses, we write key up like this. That is event. In JavaScript, we use on key up, and in Angular, we just use key up. In a parenthesis, you write the events. Just roughly, I will show you here. For example, I will put one button here. Roughly, I will keep a button here. And for that one, click. That is the button. Let's open this here. Localhost. Yeah. And on this button click, I want some function to happen. Generally, what we do is, for this, first we need to write a method. We will write a method. So on button click, you can give any name. On button click, I will just put an alert saying that button clicked. This method should be called when user clicks on this button. Generally, what we have to do in JavaScript, we write on click. But in Angular, we have to just write click. In a parenthesis, click, and which method to fire up. On button click method should fire up. We need to define. So same how you done in your JavaScript, the same you have to configure here. You need to define here. We need to configure and define here. Now, when you click on this button, now it will fire up that alert and show. Same, that is general JavaScript, only the change is the event is defined in a parenthesis, right? Just event is configured in this. So what concept you understood here is, in order to handle two-way binding, I will clean up this. In order to handle two-way binding, you need two important techniques. One is property binding, another one event. Events are configured in a parenthesis. Properties are defined in a square brace. Now, what should happen here is, the model data should be binded to UI and changes in the UI need to update it back to model. This entire process is actually managed by model. It is managed by model. Angular provides a directive called ng model. Angular model. We have a directive called ng model. This ng model is responsible for handling two-way binding. It is responsible for handling two-way binding. So it will get the data and update to the UI. And any change made in the UI, it will update back to the model. So ng model is responsible for updating the changes back, right? Binding and updating. So it is responsible for doing two things, property binding and event binding. That means actually what ng model have is, ng model contains previous value and current value. It will maintain two values. If previous value is equal to current value, then there is no change occurred. If previous value is different from current value, that means some change occurred. Based on this logic, it will identify that some change happened in the value, and it have to update those changes. So now ng model, this is interesting here. See, ng model is a directive which should handle two techniques. What is the first thing? Send the model data to view. How it is done? By using property binding. So we write this in a square brace. That is property binding. After binding to property, any change identify and update back. That is done by using event binding. Event binding is defined in parenthesis like this. Now ng model, what it will do? First, it will update the data to the property. Second, it will identify the change in that and update back by using event. That means what is the meaning of square brace and parenthesis? Square brace defines property binding, parenthesis define event binding. So ng model is going to handle property and event binding. It is going to handle property and event binding. So generally, anywhere when you are looking at Angular, you will see this ng model so effectively used for two-way binding. But important, this ng model is not directly available in Angular. That means you created an Angular project. In that project, by default, ng model is not available. ng model is available in a module. It is available in a module called forms module. ng model is available in a forms module. So in order to use this, you have to import this module. And this forms module is present in a library called Angular Forms library. That means in order to handle two-way binding, you need ng model. And ng model is a member of forms module. And forms module is defined in Angular Forms. So you don't import this, you cannot use ng model. So how it works, I will show you. So first point, who is going to handle this two-way binding? So ng model is an Angular directive. ng model is an Angular directive. That Angular directive that handles two-way binding. Actually, it uses property binding and event binding techniques. So square brace indicates property binding. and parenthesis indicates event binding. So NG model is written like this. Remember, always first property binding, after that event binding. That means it's not like you write in a parenthesis square brace. It will not work. First property binding, then event binding. That's important. Order is very important. First property binding, then event binding. So here, very important is NG model is a member of forms module. NG model is a member of forms module. It is a member of forms module defined in Angular forms library. It is defined in Angular forms library. So in order to use NG model, you have to import this library because your entire project have to use it. So you have to import, you know where to import. Import forms module in app.module.ts. Because you need to use for every component, then you need to globally put this in app module. So by default, Angular is not having NG model. So it is need to be imported from a separate library, and that is from Angular forms. Let's see now. So in order to use two-way binding, so we need here, let's go to the app module. Let's go to app module. In the app module, you have to import forms module. And as I already told you, components are imported in declarations. Modules are imported in imports. So you have to import in this imports. So first we have to import here. Import. What is the module name? Forms module from Angular forms. You have to import forms module from Angular forms. Then you have to configure it in imports, comma. So we have to put here forms module. That's important. So generally, when we have to use NG module is available with forms module. You have to import this. So first step, make sure that you go to appmodule.ts. In appmodule.ts, you import this. You have to import that. And in NG module, we have imports. In imports, you have to define it. I'm just giving where to make the change. Already you have a browser module and we need a forms module. What is the necessity of browser modules and all? You will see. We will learn about them one by one. So we have to import this forms module in order to use NG model. Now how two-way binding works? Let's design a screen. Let's design an interface. How two-way binding works, right? Now we are creating a form. Let's go to our data binding component. In data binding component, we are creating some properties. Suppose I am creating here product. Product is an object. Remember, you can define access modifiers. Anything is okay, but you don't need them because default access modifier is public. You want protected or private, you have to declare them. So I am just defining the properties. What are the properties we have? Anywhere you can define in the class. I am creating the property name product. Product is any type. It is an object. The product object contains name. So name contains some name, and it contains price. Suppose this is price, and it contains like stock. These three details I will give. That means we have a string and we have a number and a boolean. And suppose I added like some city. So city. So Delhi. Like this we added some details. Delhi. I will use this single quote regularly. We will use a common pattern. Okay. Right. Now here we have the details of a product. Product object is there. I need to get the details and display in the UI. I need to bind to the UI. So we have a string, number and boolean type of values. So what we do, let's go to the HTML. In the HTML, I am designing here data div. Class, I will put a row. This is bootstrap grid like. I will put a column 3 and another class we will put as column 9. This is some bootstrap columns. Now in this we defined here register product, and for that we are creating a data list, data term. This is product name. For product name we will put a text box. Input type is equal to text. Input type is equal to text. And similarly another data term price. Price is also text box. Input type is equal to text. Now another is city and data definition. Here I will put a drop down. In the drop down we will put options like Hyderabad. We will put option like Delhi. We will put option like Mumbai. Like this we define. Now we have another data term stock, and I will keep here a checkbox. Input type is equal to checkbox, and here in the checkbox I will put as available. Now this is a simple form we designed, and we will keep bootstrap classes. It will have form control, and this also will have form control, and this will have a class called form select. These are all bootstrap classes, form select. Okay. And you see this is the checkbox. This is how the form looks like. Now this is a text box. This is price. This is drop down. And this is a checkbox, because you know latest bootstrap, you can use form switch. And for checkbox, we use a property class called form check input. Now you can make the checkbox appear like a switch like this. This is checkbox. This is all latest bootstrap that you have learned, whatever bootstrap you know, right? Now this is the form. Now whatever data is present in our model, we need to bind that to this controls. We can use property binding, we can use attribute binding, we can use interpolation, but no, because we want two-way binding. Two-way binding means any change made in it should be updated back. For example, see now what I am doing here in the right side column. I will keep another heading. This is product details. Here we will keep a data list. Here we will keep a data list with data term, name, data definition, another data term price, data definition, another data term is city, and another data term is data definition, and another data term is stock and data definition, like this. Now here very important is we need to display those details. Whatever details are entered here, those need to be updated here. For example, first I will show you what we were doing previously. We were using property binding. See here, I need to display the data. Whatever data is present in that, I need to display here. I will write here, just interpolation I am using. Because here I need to just display. I am not expecting any change to be made here. We don't do any change here. We will just display here. So only display, because data definition is only for displaying. So here I am using product dot name, and here I am using product dot price. I am using product dot price. Here I am using product, that is the object you created, that is city. And here I am using product dot stock. And you can see those details are displayed here. That means we are displaying the details here. And stock is a boolean. It is showing true or false. You can write expression. Suppose I put in a parenthesis and I put a question mark, and I say if stock is equal to true, it should display available. Otherwise, it should display out of stock. You know ternary operator. By using the ternary operator, we are displaying either available or out of stock based on the boolean value. And it is displaying there available. But very important is, now I need to bind this to text box also. Now I can bind by using interpolation technique, or I can bind using property binding technique, which we done. For example, here we will go to value. In value, I can use property binding. Property binding means in square brace, value is equal to what we have to display, product dot name. We want to display that product dot name, and I saved it. And you can see now here, you can see it is displayed. But when I make any change into this, it is not updating back here. That means if it is not changing, this is not changing, means it is not updating back. Because you are using property binding or interpolation or attribute binding. They all are one-way binding. You make any change, it is not updated back. If it is updated back, it should reflect here. Because for both of these, data is coming from where? So here price is not, so data is coming from this location. So if any change made, it should update here. And if it is updated here, it will update in the details. So that is not happening by using this property binding. So now you have to change this. What we have to do, now you know the technique. You have to put a square brace, that is property binding. You have to put a parenthesis, that is event binding. Who will manage these two? ng model. That's it. That means now ng model, what it will do is, it will get the value and it will bind to property. What is the property? It will take default property. Default property is value. And whatever change made, that means whenever you are making change in the value, that it will update by using event binding. That means by using property and event binding, it is updating back. Now you can see here, You can see I make change here. So it is updating back. This is two-way binding. Previously, you are using property binding. It is displaying, but it is not updating. So that means it is not allowing change. Now the same price, city, stock should happen. So see, now I go to price text box, and here we have to use property binding, event binding by using ng model. And from where it should get the data? It is from product dot price. Now similarly, drop down property event binding. What is it? ng model. And it is so from product dot city. You see, actually the default city was Delhi, then automatically it should select this. Whatever default values are there, it will be there. Actually, first city is Hyderabad, but actual in this city we have Delhi, then automatically it should select it. We will see. Now for checkbox also, we will put here ng model, and it is product dot what is it? Stock. This ng model is very intelligent. So Angular have designed this ng model in such a way that it will decide which property to use to identify the change. That means if it is a text box, it is value. But if it is a checkbox, it is not value. Checkbox selection changed or not depends on which property. Checkbox selection changed or not, that depends on checked property. That depends on checked property, na checkbox checked. That depends on checked property. So ng model is very intelligent. It can identify the value changed or not based on the control type. If it is checkbox, it will verify checked change. If it is text box, it will verify value change. If it is drop down, it will verify option change. It will verify option change. So you don't need to tell where change should happen. It knows where the change happens. That is how it is designed. Now you see, now we are not using any events or anything, just technique. And you can see here, all these are ready. And see, by default, it is Delhi. By default, checkbox is checked. By default, checkbox is checked because we have true. Now I turn off the checkbox, it will be out of stock. I turn off the checkbox, it will be out of stock, available or not. You can check here. You can select the city. You see default Delhi. You can select the city. It will select the city. You can enter the price. That price will be taken here. So it will take the price. I am making some change in this product. It will be updated back. So this is two-way binding. In two-way binding technique, so first it will bind the data to the view. Second, it will identify the changes in the view and update back. What is the mechanism behind this? Same, it is using MVC framework. It is using MVC framework. That means whatever data is in model, it is sent to controller. From controller, it's sent to the view. And whatever change you made in the view, it will come to controller. From controller, it will update here. Because here our controller is this file. Our controller is this file. This is the controller. Now, if you make any change, first where it is coming here. It will update that. After updating, it will display the new data in this location. Here, why I am not using property binding or attribute binding or interpolation? Because I need to just show the data inside the container. In that case, only showing the data, you can use anything. Right? You can use property or property or attribute or interpolation. Here we cannot do that because here we are expecting changes. When we are expecting changes, then we have to use this mechanism. So that means how ng model can manage. Actually, ng model uses MVC framework. Uses you can say ng model is a MVC framework component, that identifies the changes based on previous value and current value. That means conditions are, if previous value is equal to current value, that means that no change detected. So if previous value is not equal to current value, then it means that change detected. So that is the reason ng model is known as single source of truth. ng model is known as single source of truth. Technically, that means as a developer point, technically, architecturally, we call it as single source of truth. Model is considered as single source of truth because it contains information of a value, and that information tells what is previous, what is current. That means model is considered as single source of truth. Why it is called single source of truth? Because model contains information about the previous value and the current value, whether change occurred or not. So in many interviews at experience level, these type of technical words are used. That means what is the mechanism of model, how it updates data. So we have to tell by using single source of truth. You might have learned already OOP concepts of JavaScript. Has a relation, is a relation, like terms. Has a relation means aggregation. Is a relation means inheritance. These are all technical terms. We have to use them. And at experience level, these kind of questions will come. Why model is called single source of truth? And what is single source of truth in MVC? In MVC, ng model is considered as single source of truth. Why it is considered as single source of truth? Because it contains the complete metadata about value. Metadata about value means what the value is, previously what it is, currently what it is there any change occurred or not. Everything is managed by this ng model. So this is two-way binding technique. So you have learned two techniques. One is one-way binding, another one two-way. Here very simple. What we have done, we accessed the data, we maintain data here, and we accessed the data, and we are displaying the data here. We are managing the data here. Okay, I will give this example. In this example, we have data binding component .ts. I will give that complete TS code so that it is not confusion for you. Complete TS code I will give. Another one is data binding .component.html. That complete HTML code also I will give. This is the example for two-way binding. This is only first example. Later you will learn so many complex things. right? Radios, checkboxes, drop downs, list boxes, how to work with them and all. Currently, we are just using this concept, how one-way binding works and how two-way binding works. Now, you have seen one-way and two-way binding technique by using MVC framework. Now, Angular can handle this by using MVVM framework. You have seen with MVC framework. In MVC framework, we have a model and a view and a controller. We can handle the same by using MVVM framework. But what is good, what is bad, which situation we have to use, we need to know all that. What is MVVM framework? Actually, MVVM is model view and view model. Model view and view model. Here important is view model. Actually, view model comprises of it contains data and application logic. View model contains data and application logic. Previously, application logic is present in controller. Now we don't need controller. We don't need controller for handling the data. Without controller, we can manage the data. Without controller, we can manage the data. That means actually MVVM framework is nothing but technically, see, we generally have a model. Model usually contains the data. Data is inside the model. And we contain a view. View usually contains the UI, user interface. So we have the user interface and we have the data. Now, previously, the communication was managed by controller. But now we don't have a controller. So in this model itself, that means in this model itself, what we do is this model itself, that means we will maintain actually view model. View model means here I will keep. Here itself, what we do is we maintain the logic. The logic is configured at the view level. It is configured at the view level. That means there is no separate requirement of controller. Controller is not required. This controller is not required. Earlier model have to use the controller. And in this controller, we used to put this logic actually. Now this is inside this location. Means inside the view itself, we are maintaining the logic. Now we don't need this separate controllers work. So what it can do is, it can bypass the controller and directly interact. It can directly interact with the view. That means in the view itself, you maintain the logic and it will update back to the model. We can bypass this controller. No need of using a controller for managing the data and interactions. Now, what is good? What is bad? This type of concept is good. Why it is good? Because you are reducing the work of controller. That means it will reduce the number of requests. It will reduce requests. Reduce requests means what happens? It will improve initial load time. Initial load time will improve. Initial load time will improve because number of requests are reduced. And it is good for inline technique. Inline documentation means we don't have multiple files. Everything is maintained in one file. It is good for inline technique. So MVVM is good in three ways. It will reduce the number of requests. It will improve the initial load time, and it is good for inline documentations. But what is bad? What is bad? Imagine in the UI itself, if you are maintaining all your logic also. In the UI itself, you are maintaining all your logic also. That means this UI becomes heavy. the UI becomes heavy because UI should contain only presentation, but you are giving the logic part also to the UI. That means UI becomes very heavy. And you say initial load time is slow, fast, improved, but rendering will be so. It will be rendering slow. Initial load time is good, but rendering will be slow. Rendering means you done any interaction, generating output and updating and showing it, it will take time. Initial load time you improved, but render time also should improve. But here there is no render time. What is another problem? Another problem is extensibility issues, reusability issues. Extensibility issues, reusability issues means you cannot easily extend because UI and logic combined. If UI and logic is separated, it is good. It is easy to extend. If UI is integrated with the logic, so then it is difficult to separate them and it is difficult to test. It is difficult to extend. Testing issues will be there. Then when to use this? Better use this, as I already told you, when you need a component without regular extensions. You need a component without regular extensions, without regular changes, with a specific stable functionality, then better go with what kind of technique? MVV. So see how MVVM works. Everything simple, but some changes you have to do. See how MVVM works. And here in the MVC architecture, you see this is where from data is coming. This is where from the data is coming. That means we are maintaining the data here. It will come here, it will manage. But now we will see MVVM, how MVVM works. You delete this. There is no data. There is nothing inside the controller. Our controller is an empty class. We don't have anything here. It's a simple empty class. Okay. That means there is no use of controller here. We are ignoring it. Now how we can manage the data? That means now text box don't have this, and this text box also don't have this. Drop down is also not having this, and stock also not having this, and output also, these are not there anymore because I deleted that. So let it be an empty form. Okay. That means this all I removed, it is not there. All I removed, it is not there. Everything is empty now. So now we don't have any data inside this controller, anything configured inside the controller. Now you see here, let's go to the data binding component HTML. Here, what we are doing is this text box, whatever they enter in text box, we need to store in the memory of UI itself. That means in browser memory on. That means we need to store the data that is entered inside the text box, and we don't want to use the controller. So we want to use and maintain in the view model. We want to define it in the view model. So here we need to configure ng model. This ng model will make this text box dynamic. If ng model is not defined, the text box is static. How we can make the static text box dynamic? Once it is dynamic, then only Angular can take control of it. Then we have to mark it with ng model. Okay, we made it dynamic. After making it dynamic, now what happens actually is, see, for this text box, memory is allocated. Because you made it dynamic, Angular will allocate memory for text box. Now what we have to do is, we have to collect the value entered in the text box. Collect the value entered in the text box and store in that memory. And from the memory, again, we need to access and update, right? that who is going to manage your memory? It is managed by ng model. That means I will tell you now here a simple point. So what you have done here, this is a text box, and we configured like this: input type is equal to text, and it is not at, this is your Angular library, this is Angular library memory. Now Angular, this is the Angular application memory, this is the memory. Now what happened is, for this text box, it is still static. Once you define ng model, then what it will do is, for this text box, it will maintain a memory. For this text box, it will maintain a memory. So if it is maintaining a memory, we should have a reference name for memory. What is the reference name? Because if there is another text box, for another text box, it will maintain another memory. For drop down, it will maintain another memory. For checkbox, it will maintain another memory. That means there must be a reference name for memory. The reference name for memory is defined. The reference name for memory need to be defined. So I will give memory reference name as name. This is as price. This is as city, and this is as a stock. Right? The memory reference name to be defined. And who should use this memory reference? This ng model should use that memory reference, so that it can store data in the memory, it can access the data from the memory, it will do. Remember, all this happening in the UI. We are not taking help of controller. We are managing everything in the UI. Then in that case, UI will be very heavy. It's not simple, because lot of things you are doing in the UI. So how it happens? See, now what we have to do is, we made it dynamic. After making it dynamic, we have to give a reference name in the memory. Reference names are given by using hash. Reference names are given by using hash. The memory reference used by model will be a ID reference actually. That because hash means unique. You know that hash is used for ID. ID means it must be unique. That means there must not be any another name used with the same name identifier must not be there. So what is the name? Name. Who should use this name? This ng model have to use that name. Now this is the two-way binding using MVVM. This is two-way binding by using MVVM. Now what will happen? First, this text box becomes dynamic. Who will make it dynamic? ng model. Once it is dynamic, memory is allocated for it. With which name memory will be allocated? Name. And whatever value is stored inside it, it will be retrieved and used by this ng model. Whatever is there, it will be updated also by using the same ng model. ng model is now managing both. It is managing the memory for text box. That means you put any value, you make any change in the value, everything it knows. ng model knows the value changes, and ng model can display and bind the values. Now the same thing we have to do for every text box. Same thing we have to do for every text box. Now see here, what is the second text box? How to make it dynamic? By using ng model. What is the reference name for it? Hash price. And who should manage this? ng model. That is how we need to define. Similarly, what about the drop down? Drop down should use ng model. What is the reference name? Reference name is city. Who will manage that? ng model. Same. Now the reference, similarly, now come back here. This is the checkbox. Here we have to use ng model. Hash stock is equal to ng model. Now every element that you want to dynamically handle, it should be marked as ng model. and every element should have a reference ID that is defined with hash, and that reference ID must be used by the model to access the data and store the data into it. Now this is done, but one problem is there. The problem, this is okay, this is working fine, everything is fine, but one problem is, as per the rules of elements, form elements, I hope you learnt in HTML, form cannot submit the value of any element until or unless it is having a name. I hope you know that. You learnt in HTML that form cannot submit the value if it is not having a name. For example, suppose this is a demo. See, I have a form. In that form, I have username, and this is your general HTML. In this, we have input type is equal to text, and I kept a button submit. And you see here, in the form, we have a button. I entered the username and I click on submit. It is not submitting the value. Form cannot submit the value of any element until or unless a name is defined for it. It is compulsory, it is mandatory that every element should have a name. So you give a name, username, then it is able to submit that value and define that. That means I will refresh, and I am defining the name, username. I entered something here and submit. It is displaying that and showing. That is basic form rule. In HTML, you will learn this rule, right? When you are learning about forms, that a form cannot submit its control data until or unless a name is defined. And the same point here is, you mentioned the model ID. Mention the model ID for these text boxes, but Angular cannot identify these text boxes and collect the values whenever you made some changes, because changes made means you are submitting. When you are submitting, it cannot recognize. So it is very important that every element should have a name. Model cannot recognize the element, and it cannot get its value if there is no name defined. And very important, this name should match with the model name. The name that you give for element should match with the model name. Match with the model name. What is the model name? Model name is name. And this also name, what is the model name? Price. This also name, and what is the model name? City. And this is checkbox. This is also name. What is it? Stock. This is important. Now see, so much messed up in our UI. Previously it was very simple. Only one option we were using, ng model. But now you have to define a name. You have to define an ID. You have to configure an ng model. ID should be assigned to that ng model. Everything happening in UI. Previously, we were using only square brace, parenthesis, ng model. But now so much you have to do in the UI. Now it is ready. Okay, it is ready. Now how to display this? How to display this in this location? Now very important is, every model you defined in the memory, it will be treated as an object type. Every model you defined in the memory is treated as an object type. That means name is an object, price is an object, city is an object, stock is an object. It is not string type or number type or boolean type. It is actually object type. That means, why it is configured as an object? That means name is defined as an object, and every model object, actually remember, every model object contains so many properties. Every model object contains so many properties. Observe carefully. We will try to access this name here. We will try to access the name here. What is the reference name? Simply name. And what is the reference name? The reference name is price. What is the reference name here? Reference name is city. What is the reference name here? Reference name is stock. And you will observe interestingly, all are object. Name is an object, price is an object, city is an object. That means when you configured any element as a model, model is considered as an object. Now what this object contains actually, every element that is in the memory is an object. This object contains so many properties. Angular ng model object, this is called ng model object. ng model object contains properties like value. It contains property like valid. It contains property like invalid. It contains property like pristine. It contains property like dirty. So many properties will be there. These are the properties of that object. Dirty, we have touched, we have untouched. Like this, so many will be there. These are all the properties of that particular model, which you will see in later stages. While learning validations and all, you will understand about that. Currently, in that, only one we need. What is it? Value. That means whatever entered in name, it is returned by using value. What about others? Others are nothing but they will verify are the elements valid or not. That means if you are using required, if you are using patterns, they can even verify, is it valid, is it invalid. Pristine means it is not modified. Dirty means it is modified. All these things you need while learning validations. In validations, we will use them. So technically, this is very important point here. In MVVM approach, models are configured as view model. Models are configured as view model, which contains logic and presentation, which contains both logic and presentation. And very important is ng model configures a view model. ng model configures a view model. So that means how it configures a view model. Syntax will be like this. Input type is equal to text, and we have ng model. Now another important, ng model requires an ID reference to store and access data. It requires an ID reference for storing and accessing the data. So how do we define that? Input type is equal to text. ng model, it needs hash some name is equal to ng model. That is the memory reference name. And very important, Angular model cannot access value of element if name is not defined. So it's very important that it should have a name. Input type is equal to text, name is equal to name, and ng model and hash name is equal to ng model. So much work. Right? This is what we have to do. And very important, Angular model is an object that comprises of following properties. It contains so many properties. We have value, we have pristine, we have dirty, so we have valid, we have invalid, we have touched, we have untouched, we have errors. All these are present. These are all the important properties. Now, what is present inside model, it is done by using value. And is it valid or not? Is it touched or not? Is it modified or not? That is managed by others. So later in validations, you will see that why they are used, how they are used, right? We will currently use only one property. What is it? Value. So see here, all are returning as object, and you know how to access the value. To access the value, what we have to do? Name is an object. We have to use name dot value. Name dot value. Similarly, price is an object. Price dot value. City is an object. City dot value. And stock is an object. And stock dot value. And now you see here. I'm entering some name. It is entered there. I entered some price. It is entered there. I selected some city and I defined here. But remember, there is nothing in my controller now. There is nothing in my controller, not even a single reference. Then without the controller, everything is being managed by using this. That means everything you are managing in the UI, everything you are handling in the UI level, configuring in the UI level, managing at the UI level. This is very complex. Remember, this is good, the bad, both are there. Why? Because now previously, if I have to handle all this, that means generally what we have to do previous, that means we have a input type is equal to text, and we have only one concept. What is it? ng model, and it uses a reference name. But now we need to configure with so many things. We need to define a ng model. We need to define a name. We need to configure a reference name used by ng model. If any one is missing, it will not work. ng model is compulsory. ng model is compulsory. Name is compulsory. So ID reference is compulsory, right? And you have to configure this ng model as name reference. So accessing the value, so we can access by using name dot value. We can access name dot pristine, like this we can do. Pristine and all not required currently. In the next levels we will see that. So this is MVVM approach. Remember, in one component we can use both MVVM and MVC also. That means it's not like a component will use only MVVM or it will use only MVC, because it is an hybrid application. You can put MVVM for certain operations. You can use MVC for certain other operation. Because in a component, we have asynchronous techniques. That means one part will do one work, another part will do another work. AJAX uses references will be there. In that case, you can design a component which can use both techniques at a time. That means one is MVC, another one MVV. It's not like you have to use only one. So it can handle both of them. Both of them it can handle. For example, see, suppose I'm giving here category. Category is a string type and it contains an option electronics. Like this we are configuring. Category is a string type and we are defining electronics. Right? Now I need to use that here. Because already you have a model reference. Here I need to show the category, so that user can select the category or choose the category here. Suppose you see here I am adding another data term, so category, and here data definition, here I am using, so select. This time it contains an option, say footwear. It contains an option like fashion. So it contains an option like electronics. Now I can use here two-way binding technique. And what is the binding data to be defined here? We need to define the category. That means whatever category you defined, uppercase, right? That category you can configure here. Then how do we access and use it? So of course, we have to just display here another data term category, and we need to get this because it is not MVVM approach. Here we just use the category. That's it. No value, because this is using the MVC approach. It is getting from the controller, right? In that case, everything works fine. So you entered some details, you entered some price, you selected a city, and you selected, it will display. But by default, it will be electronics, and the stock, it is true or false. Of course, is it available or not? You can write logic like this. A condition, if value is equal to true, then we should keep it as available. Otherwise, out of stock. You can define the expression, it will display that. You turn on this, it will display available. So in one form, you can have both mechanisms. It's not like it is MVC or MVVM, right? So what is the advantage of MVVM approach and when to use it? Those points I told you. That means when we are not looking for regular, because how you will extend this? This is very much complicated. Extending a form, right? Updating the forms, adding new features to the forms, it's difficult. So that is but this is good if you are dealing with a static functionality, stable functionality. We don't need suppose you have a login, as I told you, user ID, password, submit, nothing else. And every day it is the same work to be done. I don't need any extensions. Then I can better go with the MVVM approach. We don't need much work of controller. We have to just submit the data to APIs. So you can bypass the controller and we can implement this technique. Now in this example, you don't need about TS file. You just need only one option. What is it? Actually here, data binding dot component dot HTML only. In TS, I added one, just for difference I showed you. We added a category. Category is a string type and it is some electronics. That's it. But it is actually not required. Everything is managed in data binding dot component dot HTML. And this is all done in the HTML only. We don't need to do anything inside. This is the basic approach of how we can manage data binding. In data binding, we have learned two techniques, one-way binding, two-way binding. We have learned several approaches, interpolation, property binding, attribute binding. So MVC and MVVM. Now in this, some more points are there, data binding related. That means how we can handle various interactions. This is only simple data. Now complex data, how we present. Means an array is there, an object is there, an array of objects are there. How do we present that? That is very important. That we'll see next session, right? Tomorrow we will see about the other directives, how to work with them and use them. Okay, right.